Hi, everybody. Thank you again for being here, and it's been such a fantastic program throughout the day. I'm really excited to be joined by Gillian Caldwell, who is the Chief Climate Officer at USAID, and in that role oversees all things climate in U.S. development assistance, humanitarian assistance, and more widely. So thank you so much for being here.
Thanks for having me.
I'd love to start with better understanding the USAID's climate strategy. We hear that USAID is pivoting to increasingly become a climate agency. What does that mean, and what does a whole-of-agency approach to climate look like for USAID?
Well, let's start with the imperative, which is that the climate crisis threatens to unravel 60 years of development progress. This crisis is jeopardizing our work across every single sector. In the context of our development work overseas, we do work in education, democracy, rights and governance, humanitarian assistance, global health. You could just imagine the kinds of impacts that this crisis is having in all of those terrains. And likewise, there are real opportunities to ensure equity in the context of how we reinvent the world that we live in today. So a year ago on Earth Day, we actually launched our most ambitious climate strategy ever, which takes us through 2030 with 6 very ambitious targets. One is to reduce carbon emissions by 6 billion tons. That's about 1.5 times all U.S. emissions in 2021. We will do that largely through nature-based solutions. So we are going to be protecting and preserving 100 million hectares of carbon-critical landscapes. We're also leading President Biden's emergency initiative on adaptation and resilience, or PREPARE. And in that context, we want to reach 500 million people with life-saving information and early warning systems pertinent to climate shocks. We're also going to catalyze $150 billion in public and private finance to try to, begin to approach the yawning gap in projected climate finance needs of $3 to $5 trillion a year by 2030. And because equity is so core to our strategy, we want to really reshape and advance the opportunity for marginalized communities in at least 40 of the 80 countries where we have a footprint. Briefly, becoming a climate agency means that every single mission, bureau, and operating unit is being asked to contribute to those targets. They can decide how they contribute, whether it makes the most sense for them to lean in on adaptation and resilience, or whether they have carbon mitigation potential. But all the missions and our global health and education and other teams are right now, as we speak, delivering their proposed climate action plans to advance their work in this area, which largely means contouring programs in new directions as programs come to an end, reconsidering program design to see if there can be more climate benefits, and of course, proactively avoiding negative climate consequences.
Wow, that's fascinating and far-reaching. I'd love to pick up on one particular thread, and that relates to financing and support to LDCs, the most vulnerable, and so on and so forth. This has been a recurring theme of conversation today. We heard about it earlier from the National Climate Advisor, Ali Zaidi, as well as from the Special Envoy, John Kerry. So my question for you is, how exactly is USAID partnering with private sector to mobilize the $150 billion goal by 2030, and where will that money go? Kind of what's the biggest priorities for that money?
Well, we're obviously very much focused on what we can do in the adaptation context to set the stage for more private sector investment there, because only 2% of private sector investment in climate finance at this stage is going to adaptation. The vast majority is going to renewable energy. And not surprisingly, we project that 138 of the 150 billion we will catalyze will be through renewable energy auctions in the many countries where we work. We have already catalyzed over $26 billion over the last decade by providing the technical assistance to design and establish auctions where private sector investors can bid to provide renewable energy to governments in the global south at affordable rates and predictable rates over time. And Of course, before we do that, we ensure the kind of enabling environment that the private sector would want to see, further to the conversations we heard earlier about the Inflation Reduction Act and related tax credits and financial incentives. So there will be a lot on in and through the energy auctions. And beyond that, we'll be looking at developing investable projects, at serving as a matchmaker to bring private sector investors to the table with our partners on the ground, and I think importantly, providing concessional finance, something akin to a first loss guarantee or that base pyramid level finance that helps de-risk investments in countries that have higher credit risk ratings. And of course, in that context, we'll be collaborating closely with the International Development Corporation, or the DFC, as well as the Millennium Challenge Corporation, MCC, two other sister federal agencies.
That's fascinating, and I know we had some conversations earlier related to the DFC's role and kind of this complementarity across institutions. I'd love to go back to another thing that you mentioned earlier, and that related to decarbonization of USAID's work. And so can you talk a little bit about how you're working on emissions reductions generally, and also in terms of, how AID operates globally?
Right, so we do, under our strategy, have a special objective called Do Our Part, and that is focused, as all federal agencies have been asked to, on reducing our own carbon footprint. So we will be net zero by 2050, that's the goal. 30 to 40% of our emissions are through travel, as one might expect, given the fact that we're a global development agency. So we've issued new guidelines to help people really scrutinize carefully decisions to travel, especially air travel, which is so carbon intensive. We're also looking to electrify vehicle fleets, change the source of energy, move to more efficient buildings, and look at procurement and supply chains. Interestingly, if you think about our humanitarian assistance or our global health assistance, they're shipping vast quantities of product all around the world every day. Can they phase out single-use plastics? Can they move, as they have, from flights to shipping by water, which substantially reduces the footprint? So that's, for USAID's own work and through its implementing partners, one piece of the puzzle. As I mentioned, of the 6 billion tons we want to reduce through our programmatic work in partnership with our partners around the world, 5 billion tons will be achieved through nature-based solutions. That's keeping carbon-critical landscapes such as the Amazon and the Congo rainforest standing. Interestingly, for those who aren't aware, mangroves and seagrasses are even more carbon dense than forests themselves. And of course, there are things we can do in terms of our agricultural work through our resilience and food security team to reduce the carbon intensity of agriculture, which is a major driver of deforestation and carbon emissions. So that's a large share of how we'll achieve those emissions reductions. And then circling back to what I said earlier, through the renewable energy auctions, we're bringing many gigawatts online every year all around the world.
That's great. So many different pathways, and I especially love the idea of focusing more on mangrove forests, which are often overlooked. Let's talk a little bit about the people that USAID supports and the communities. And specifically, I wanted to ask you, how does the agency's climate strategy center marginalized communities around the world in its work? And how is the agency working directly with local communities on implementation when it comes to adaptation and resilience goals?
Okay, well, I think, as I mentioned, equity is really a sort of foundational principle for this strategy. So we have explicit goals regarding supporting Indigenous people and local communities, women, youth, and other marginalized groups. As regards Indigenous people and local communities, of course, Indigenous people steward the vast majority of the carbon-critical landscapes around the world, and studies show that they do so far more effectively than any other stewards. And yet they face consistent persecution. They're thrown off their land. They may be assassinated frankly, at disproportionate rates relative to, their peers from other communities for standing up for their rights. So we really have to invest more in supporting them to sustain their lives and livelihoods in these carbon critical landscapes. We're also working in places like renewable energy. We have a project called Engendering Industries, which is in Kenya, focused on bringing women into the renewable energy future that I described earlier. And of course, we have studies that suggest that the companies that train and integrate women into these traditionally male-dominated terrains actually see positive benefits in terms of the productivity that they're generating.
I love that last example, because one of the things we've been talking about today is the differential impacts of climate change based on race, class, gender, ethnicity, and so on. And we know that women are the majority of smallholder farmers in the world, and so they're not only disproportionately impacted, but really on the front lines of that adaptation and resilience work. I'd love to end by asking you a little bit about, I'm sure you're traveling all over the world, seeing projects, meeting people. Are there any really innovative programs that you've seen that have really inspired you or excited you, or that you want to really shine a spotlight on, where you feel like, despite the enormity of the challenge, there's a lot of hope to be taken from what you've seen?
It's hard to pick just one. I think one issue that's really on my mind is the need for circularity and a circular economy. If the plastics value chain were a country, it would be the world's fourth largest emitter. I mean, we simply cannot afford to continue producing single-use plastics. And it's not just the production of plastics that's a problem, it's the disposal of plastics. Only a small fraction of the plastics that are produced worldwide actually ever are recycled. And as that waste deteriorates, it generates methane, which is a highly toxic, short-lived climate pollutant. We're doing some really innovative work. We've actually targeted through our Save Our Seas program 4 countries in Asia I think it's actually 10 countries in Asia that represent 40% of global mismanaged plastic waste. And to the equity point, we're working to integrate the participation of women waste pickers into projects that focus on the circular economy. We're recruiting companies to work with us to advance what's called extended producer responsibility across sectors, so that companies need to take more accountability for their production and disposal. And I think we're so incipient in this area, but I think there's really exciting work to be done. And it's exciting that leading companies such as Unilever and Mars are actually on record talking about the need for extended producer responsibility.
Well, I think that's another perfect example of that multi-stakeholder approach and partnership you alluded to earlier. Well, Gillian, thank you so much for your leadership at USAID and the work that you're doing, and also for joining us today and talking a little bit about your work. It's been wonderful to have you.
Thank you for having me, and thanks for sticking around. I know it's the end of the program.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.